Okay, so one of the first things that we look at when we're trying to deal with anxiety around music is really what I'm terming a blueprint of your kind of values and your beliefs and your rules around music. Now, obviously, this also occurs as an actual person. What are your beliefs and your values and your rules in life? But that kind of will be way too big a subject since we're dealing with music. But it is something to look into. And there's some quite interesting things you can look at. For example, what we call typologies. If anyone has heard of the Enneagram or the Jungian kind of personality types, these are all things that you can look at to sort of understand a bit more about yourself. Now, it's interesting that some people don't really want to be typecasted as a particular type of person. Often they are particular types of people. But I'm not going to go into really the things like the Enneagram or the Jungian typologies. What I'm going to do is just ask a series of questions that really relate directly to music, because that's what this course is all about. This all comes from the idea of the oracle at Delphi, and one of the main kind of commands, which was know thyself. If you actually understand yourself, then you are able, I think, to handle anxiety a lot better. So the first question is, and this is a bigger one really, is who are you, particularly as a musician, compared to who you are expected to be. So a lot of people fall into music because they are kind of told or suggested that they have to take up a particular thing, or they're told that they're very good at a particular thing and that they're encouraged to do it. But often, as the years kind of unfold, they find that they're not necessarily doing what they actually would want to do as a musician themselves. What they're doing is a kind of like a accumulation of what other people have told them they should do, or what other people have told them that they are good at. So one of the things you might want to slowly dig into is, as a musician, who do you actually want to be? What kind of music do you actually want to play? And one of the ways of guiding yourself with that is really to think about your values around music and why you do it in the first place. Now again, whilst I'm going through this, I will answer some of these questions from my own perspective, just to kind of give a few kind of cues. But what you want to do again is to write some of these ideas down. So number one is really, what do you actually value about music? Why do you do it in the first place? Some people could answer that immediately. They love the idea of expressing themselves, or they find it creative, or it's something that relaxes them, or it's something that actually addresses a kind of competitive nature in them, that they actually want to get better and better. There's all sorts of different reasons, and none of them are wrong at all, although some of them can create more anxiety than other reasons. But one of the ways of thinking about what do you value about music is a scenario where you could think, for example, if you were playing music at a school, for example, a school assembly, you'd go on in to kind of visit a school assembly, and some kid comes up to you afterwards and says, why are you a musician? What's so good about music? And you've got like half a minute to answer that person. What would you actually say to them? What is it that you actually genuinely like about being a musician and doing music? So this is something to think about. For me, music is something I love because it's a very expressive but very kind of visceral and tangible mode of expression. I'm also you wouldn't believe it by looking at the drawings I do on the board, but a children's book illustrator. And this was something actually I did for most of my childhood and teenage years until I fell into jazz, and that actually took over. One of the reasons why that took over was I like the immediacy of music as a form of expression. When you sit drawing, it's a very, very slow process which can involve kind of rubbing things out and then going back over it, and it's very sort of on your own as a process. And I like it, but it's very different to music where you instantly are playing and expressing immediately. So that's really important to me, and there are a few other things that I love, particularly about jazz and the way that kind of I find a very moving form of music, the kind of the feel of swing. There's all sorts of different things, but what you want to think about is, what do you actually value about music and being a musician and being a performer as well. This can be guided to an extent by who do you actually like, who influenced you in the first place, the different artists, the different tracks perhaps. What you can do, which is quite a useful exercise, is to think of 3 artists that are really at the core of who you want to be as a musician, that really inspire you. Now, not everyone has got kind of like particular kind of idols or sort of people that guide them, and that doesn't matter either. But if you do, they often pave the way for explaining to you almost what it is about music that you love. If I talked about three that I like from a jazz perspective, just in terms of why they're important to me, one of them is the saxophone player John Coltrane. And the reason why I like him was he was guided by this incredible sort of search for what he called the spiritual in music, truth in music. And he never stopped constantly trying to learn from as many art forms and forms of music around the world as he could to create this kind of language that he felt was kind of channeling a sort of universal sort of energy. And, you know, he went from playing these very, very beautiful kind of standards in jazz to playing incredibly free, difficult music to listen to, because he felt guided by this kind of constant kind of layers of creativity and spontaneity that he wanted to get, and he learned as much as he could in terms of practicing and repertoire and different ways of constructing language, and I find that really inspiring. But at the same time, I love Billie Holiday because I love the simplicity of what she does and the conciseness of what she does and the sheer emotion and feeling that she generates into every single sentence. Now, when she sings. Now, these are two completely different artists, but they both feed into the inspiration that I have as a jazz musician, and they're really important to me. When I lose track of what I'm doing as a musician, I will often go back to those recordings. The third artist for me is Bill Evans. He's a piano player, and I like the logic of what he does. He's an incredibly coherent player. He's also a very coherent, philosophical, logical thinker as well when he talks, and he is a kind of third kind of part to what I love in jazz. I could name some tracks, but I won't, but it's actually interesting to think about particular tracks and albums that inspire you to get an idea of what is it that is you're searching for as a musician yourself, and why do you want to do this. Another thing you can think about is what do you want to achieve. For some people, it would be to play, you know, professionally in an orchestra. For some people, it would be kind of like to play in jazz at Ronnie Scott's and be one of the top jazz musicians. But for some people, it might be just to accompany a church choir, and I say it might be just to accompany someone, you know, a choir in a church as a piano player. And there is nothing wrong with what your goals are. And that will also feed into then how you're actually practicing and preparing and what is appropriate for you in terms of your musical journey. Some people would like to just, you know, play in folk clubs, for example, whereas other people want to be kind of the top performer of the world. And these kind of like disparate sort of goals are actually important to think, well, where do you actually potentially want to go? This is a useful thing to think about. The final one I want to look at on this particular part of the blueprint is your rules, and this is a very important one. This is the question I'd like you to think about. In order for a performance to be a success in your head, okay, I or it has to do what, okay? Now, in other words, so I've phrased it as an I have to or it has to. It depends which way you want to think about it. Now, for me, a long time ago when I was suffering from anxiety, I wanted to really impress people in the audience. That was a really important thing. These days, I don't. I think about basically whether I can just get into a kind of good flow state and do the best I can. And although that sounds cliched, it's incredibly useful in terms of a strategy in my mind. And it means that I'm not always worried about what other people are thinking. In fact, I don't really try to worry about what other people are thinking. I just try to do what I can do and to get into the right sort of performance state. And if I do that, even if it goes wrong, I feel like I've succeeded. Now, some people, their rule is everything has to go perfectly. And other people, their rule has to be that everyone needs to look like they're enjoying the performance. Now, again, these are not necessarily bad rules at all, because someone that wants to do a perfect performance is going to work incredibly hard and meticulously to get as good as they can possibly do. But if this is causing you a problem, you might want to back down a certain amount and actually allow yourself more leeway as a performer. Now, these are things that are all open to interpretation, and it's not for me at all to say what a good rule and a bad rule is, but most people that tend to not get anxious tend to have fairly flexible rules that don't rely on controlling other people's experiences or reception of what you do, because you do not have control over other people. You can become a brilliant performer, but you can still have some people that are left cold with what you're doing in the audience. So I think that so long as you focus on what you can do yourself, then other people will be receptive to you. And also, when you're not worrying about what other people are thinking, or always thinking about never making a mistake, and actually allow yourself into the flow of the music, then you start getting this incredible kind of feedback between the audience and you, and it feels like a kind of circle of energy rather than a them against you scenario. So these are things to think about in terms of your blueprint. Who are you? What do you value about music? Who do you actually like? Why do you like them? And what do you want to achieve? And then what are your rules around actual musical performance? Okay, so there are just a couple of other things I want to look at in terms of blueprint. And this can be explored through these kind of, again, kind of analogical or metaphorical questions. When I am performing at my best, it is like. This is an interesting question to ask yourself. So this relates directly to performing. When I'm performing at my best, it is like. Now, I ask you then to use your imagination and just to have a think, what is it like? So picture a performance where you are actually performing at your best, something that actually either happened or in your imagination. It could be a hypothetical performance. I have certain ideas, for example, of performances where it was really going well, again in a kind of jazz group that I was playing at, and everything seemed to really flow very well. And for me, one of the sort of ideas that I think about is now I don't surf, but imagine if it is like kind of surfing the crest of a wave, this kind of smooth kind of flow, almost kind of tumbling forward. This is particularly prevalent when we're playing jazz and swing. When everything is really swinging, it kind of almost tumbles forward while still feeling quite relaxed. And this feels like the idea of kind of surfing this wave. Now, the opposite to that, which is quite an interesting one to think about again, is when I'm performing at my worst, it is like. Now, for me, it is like probably just wading through quicksand, okay? Because everything feels stilted and a struggle, and I can feel that. So, especially when I'm playing in a group and it's not really connecting very well, and you can feel everyone kind of struggling, almost fighting against each other, it's the absolute opposite of this surfing the wave. Now, I like to think about the surfing the wave metaphor when I'm going to actually perform, and try to kind of lock into that kind of like that feeling. These kind of images that you can construct in your head, in your imagination, can be very, very powerful actually. I don't really focus on this particular one, but this is what it's like, and actually I find it quite an amusing sort of idea of kind of just traipsing through kind of mud or quicksand, as you're actually performing. So I'd encourage you to explore these two questions as well as another kind of part of this exploring of your blueprint. Now, the absolute key takeaway for this section is this: you, as a musician, you need to find your own voice. Now, this is not to say that you have to be an incredibly individualistic musician that does things that are completely your own and that's the end of it. This isn't appropriate for certain forms of music at all. So it's not so much a question of being very, very idiosyncratic or kind of like thinking of being kind of away from the crowd. If you're, for example, working in orchestras, then that's not what you're really necessarily trying to do. But there is still a kind of understanding of how you actually play and express yourself within the actual style that you're doing that feels right to you. And it may be that you're actually better off working, for example, in a Baroque kind of ensemble, or there's all these different ideas. For me, again, just using my own sort of experience, I like working in small groups. So I'm not really a big band player. I love working in a trio format. I like composing music that's actually very, very simple. I'm very interested in using ideas out of Gregorian chant and coupling that with jazz harmony and sort of ideas like that. I wrote a whole series during lockdown of 12-tone row-based compositions that are very, very short and very, very simple. And I love the idea of then improvising with a small trio of that. And that's a context that works really well for me. As a bass player, I try to be very, very concise. I got caught up very much in, you have to play really fast and I have to always play this extraordinary sort of like virtuosic stuff. And I ended up injuring myself because that was not what I was good at all. And when I went to find my own strength, which is much more to do with melody and kind of like coherence and use of space, I actually found my voice. But it took me years of kind of battling this, I have to play fast like the other kind of fast jazz players, before I finally realised that there is as much strength in playing very slow kind of melodies and using space like Billie Holiday, for example, as a good example, or someone like Thelonious Monk, again, in the jazz world. These are just as important figures in jazz as the great virtuosos like, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. There's nothing wrong with it. So I think within the context that you love to work, you should find the context, the right thing for you. That's not to say you shouldn't explore lots of different kind of avenues first, but somewhere down the line you want to find where you're kind of comfortable as a performer, and then go down that direction and do what feels right for you as a musician. And this is the whole thing, use your strengths. Usually people musically have got certain strengths. Some people, I've noticed again, in 30 years of teaching jazz at a university, I've come across a huge amount of musicians who stay from 3 to 4 years, and some people have got a natural facility for speed. It's not that they don't practice, but they come in and they've got a very natural facility anyway. They pick it up incredibly fast and they work really well in that kind of fast-paced kind of thing. Other people are far better at harmony or responding to people, or are very good accompanists. And actually, if you work within your strengths, it can make you a very, very powerful musician, and again take away that anxiety of trying to compete within a field that you're not necessarily comfortable in being. It's not to say that you shouldn't push yourself as a musician, and I do, and I practice very hard, but I've found that practicing hard on the things that I'm very good at naturally has made me into the musician where I feel comfortable when I get on stage and perform, rather than trying to play almost like I'm competing all the time. So these are some of the things to consider in terms of blueprint.